Today is January 13, 2018, and we are going to continue on last night's discussion of whether materialism can be known to be true. So I'll explain a little bit more about that, but let's start with asking our Heavenly Family to guide us. Heavenly Family, thank you so very much for guiding us to contemplate these subjects and helping us to understand the truth. Please help us to have sharp minds and clear thoughts and to be able to grasp these fundamental things. Thank you so much for guiding this discussion. We ask this in the name of Branch. Amen. Okay, so to recap some of what we have been discussing, we have been asking a certain question. More particularly, I have been asking all of you a certain question. And the question has taken two primary forms. The first form is, how do you know that truth is material reality? The other way to phrase that is, how do you know that materialism is true? Again, materialism is the belief that all which exists is material, and that is a cornerstone, or better put, it is the foundation of the message, and the message proclaims that it is the foundation of all things. Yet, with that being the case, most, perhaps better to say all in the message, have had a difficult time expressing the evidence in favor of materialism. And so we're taking the time to really examine it further, and hopefully, especially in light of last night's discussion, people are starting to be able to grasp and hopefully be able to explain the reasons for holding the position that is materialism. One of the reasons why this is so important is because we need to know what is true for ourselves. And another reason why it is important is that we need to be able to explain this subject to others. Materialism is a position that this message advocates, which is an unpopular position. In fact, some of the Seventh-day Adventist pioneers, who, of course, being Seventh-day Adventists in the early days, also held this position, referred to it as the most unpopular of all Bible subjects. Of course, we would say it's broader than just a Bible subject, but it is very much so an unpopular view. Materialism is not so much an unpopular view among scientists, but certainly among those who are more concerned with moral or philosophical questions, and even more so with religion. Predominantly, religion is spiritualistic in nature in some form. In other words, it advocates the idea that there is a certain type of stuff in the universe called spirit, otherwise known as the non-physical. That's how it is typically defined. It is some other realm other than the physical. And there are multiple different views that include the belief in the existence of the non-physical. We talked about some of them last night. There are those who believe that all existence in its most fundamental nature is non-physical, and that is a view known as idealism, that mind or consciousness is in fact fundamental. Perhaps there are other views that are monist views, views which assert only one basic fundamental type of stuff, that don't particularly say that it is conscious but still non-physical, but the idealistic view holds that it is some sort of consciousness, some sort of mind which is fundamental to all existence. The more popular view is called substance dualism, which asserts that there is material stuff, but then there's also another type of stuff which is non-material. Most monotheists, for example, hold to this dualistic view of reality. Again, all views are referring to whatever the nature of reality is supposed to be in that view. So none of these views are saying that what they are asserting to be the nature of things is, simply, oh, well, this part is reality and this part that actually exists isn't reality. No, it's all claims concerning the nature of reality, but they are very different claims in nature. Whichever view, if any, is correct, this makes a huge difference in terms of all else, really. Every other type of thought, or every other thought regarding every other type of issue, is in some way rooted in how we view reality in its most fundamental sense. More specifically, for this message, the question of materialism is very important because the actual content of this message is based on materialism. This message has a primarily moral concern, and its view of morality hinges upon materialism. So we need to really understand whether materialism is true, and if so, how can we know it, and how can we explain it? And something that is very important for everyone to keep in mind is that if you as an individual cannot show something to be the case, to be true, you don't actually have any sort of evidence for others or for yourself that you know it to be true. You may strongly feel like something is true, but if you cannot provide evidence that it is, you do not really have knowledge that it is true. And belief without knowledge, even if the form of the belief happens to be correct, is no better than believing something that is incorrect. Knowledge is very, very important, and belief without knowledge does not lead to proper action, whereas actual knowledge and an acceptance of that knowledge does lead to proper action. So, with all that said, in our discussion last night, we actually started to make some progress in discussing some of the actual evidence in favor of materialism. And the way that that came about is Lynn had asked Teresa to read a certain section from the Silver Trumpet, Volume 1, Number 9, namely from pages 4 to 6, which contains within it certain explanations of evidence in favor of materialism. And the fifth paragraph on page 4 of the Silver Trumpet, Volume 1, Number 9, we ended up discussing in some detail at the end of last night's call, and we talked about the evidence which it briefly explains, which is in fact demonstrative of the truth of materialism. So tonight we want to continue on that discussion, and I want to start by asking if anyone wants to explain the evidence for materialism that you presently have, whether it is what we talked about specifically last night, or whether it is something in addition to that, or also if anyone has any comments or questions concerning this whole topic and our discussion of it so far. So pretty broad starting point, but if anyone wants to start with any of those elements, feel free to speak.
Okay, I'm going to try. Well, this is what I have so far, and okay, so how I'm going to word it is this way. How to prove that materiality is reality, or how to prove that reality is material, is to show an immaterialist or anyone that is pro-immaterial thinking is that the opposite of materiality, which is immateriality, will end up with a claim or an assertion that is synonymous to saying that non-existence exists or that nothing is something, because simply immateriality is the negative of materiality. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's actually pretty good. Yeah, no, I think that that's a fairly good way to explain it. But one thing that I would say to kind of refine it a little bit is that immateriality is the negative of all things. The definition of it is indistinguishable from the definition of the word nothing, just like it is indistinguishable from the definition of the word non-existent. Each has their own nuances, but the idea expressed by each of those collections of phonetics boils down to being the same idea. And if you notice that all of them start with a negation. No thing. No thing. So what's the basic thing there? Thing. Thing is the basic idea, and this is just no thing. Non-existence, well, existence is the base of that concept, but this is just non-existence. Immaterial, material is the base of that, and im is the negation, immaterial. Same thing, non-physical, just non-physical. That's the whole idea. So, again, whether you're talking about things, material, existence, or physicality, what is physical? This is the negation of all of that. And since the definitions of material, physical, existence, and things all overlap, and this is simply the negation of all of those things, it's the negation of all, so it is indistinguishable from those other things, from those other terms. So that's kind of the nuance that I would add. A second nuance that I would add, well, I wouldn't even just say that this is a second nuance, because it's more than a nuance. A second element that I would add is that immaterialism is by definition self-contradictory. That is to say that because of the fact that the very idea of immateriality is indistinguishable from the idea of nothing or non-existence. To say that immateriality exists is a contradiction. So the first point is just to say that by its definition, it is non-existent. It is not true by its own definition. The second point is then to say, therefore, to say that it does exist automatically contradicts itself. It is a contradiction to claim the truth of immateriality. Now, in this context, the difference between materiality and immateriality is a dichotomy. There's a such thing as a false dichotomy. This is not a false dichotomy. It is genuinely a dichotomy because one is the absolute opposite idea of the other. It's the negation, like immateriality is the negation of the idea of materiality. Therefore, if immateriality is false, that proves that materialism is true. Now, that's not the same as saying that because there's no evidence for immateriality, that materialism is true. No. It's saying that there is evidence that immaterialism is false. That requires materialism to be true. The evidence that immaterialism is false is that it is actually a self-contradictory claim because it says that the non-existent exists. Bottom line, that's what it says. So anyway, that's the addition to that. Any other comments on what we're discussing? All right, well, does anyone have any broader comments or questions regarding the topic as a whole? Or would anyone else like to try and explain evidence in favor of materialism, whether it's what we have already covered or something which we have not yet discussed?
So how do we prove that the materialism is the truth? So for example, now I'm talking to you on the phone, and this is the truth in the material world. And I can prove that this is true. And some information I cannot prove true, but it doesn't mean it's not the material world or the truth, just because I don't have evidence or knowledge to show you yet. So I would just don't know if I should believe it or not, or simply I just don't know. And materialism and immaterialism cannot be together. Immaterialism is non-exist because we believe in material world, which is the substance in the world. If you ask me what is immaterial, and there's nothing exists, so I cannot give you any example for that. But I can tell you what other people believe in material is because that's their theory, their idea, and their concept, and to make up the meaning of the word. So, for example, for our message, we believe the truth is correspond to the material, and which is physically happening in the world, and other Christianity, or like you said, the dualism, or they believe in dualism, believe in the material human being exists in material way, like God and heaven and angels, they are they are not physical. They are just like a spirit, like they can go anywhere, anytime. So those are kind of immaterial definitions that I can provide for you. Can we prove that immaterial is part of the material? No, because they contradict each other. Immaterial is not true, then I cannot say something is not true in the truth. So the evidence, back to the evidence. So for anything that is correspond to the reality and what is really happening, then that is truth, then that is in material reality. And again, we may not know the truth, we may not know the materiality because we will simply live. We didn't have knowledge, but we could have knowledge and we can learn it and we can investigate and do experiments for that, indirect experiment. That's what I have been learning today by listening to the call and reading all the material.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, there's a lot there actually to grab onto and to comment on. I kind of want to go further on one of the aspects that you mentioned early in your comment, where you said something along the lines of, we're on this call right now, and that's true because it's material reality. Now, this is another point that is actually an evidence for the truth of materialism. And it's similar in some regards to what we talked about last night, and some of the same principles apply, but it's a different point. And it's not specifically that the fact that it is true that we're on the call right now, it's not that that particular fact is an evidence of materialism, but it's that there's a certain principle that we can learn from this fact, and I would say as well as every other fact, that evidences materialism. Again, I'll kind of repeat that. It is not that the fact that we are on the call right now is true. It's not that is an evidence for materialism, but there is a principle that we can derive from that fact, which is evidence for materialism. And so what you said, Rachel, is like going in the direction of that particular principle. And it's one that we have actually discussed many times on the calls, and it's in the next paragraph in the Silver Trumpet. It's the last paragraph of page 4 of volume 1, number 9. And I'm thinking that we'll actually just read that now, and I'll ask you guys to try and explain the principle which is actually an evidence for materialism within what I'm about to read, and also within Rachel's comment, which is very similar, or at least the part of her comment that is very similar to what I'm about to read. How do we know what is real and what is not? What is the difference between imagining a thing and a thing really existing? Well, let's see. If you imagine a bird landing in your hand, that is different from a bird actually landing in your hand, right? What is the difference? Is it not that one is merely conceptual, whereas the other is actually a part of the physical world? Similarly, those of you who have been studying this message for some time have probably heard the question asked, why is such and such a thing true? For instance, if I say, you are reading these words right now, is it true? Well, yes, of course. And obviously for those on the call or listening later, you are hearing these words right now. Is it true? Well, yes, of course. Why is it true? Is it not because it is actually what is happening in the material world? These undeniable facts leave us with the truth that materialism is indeed how we know the difference between what is real, true, and what is not. Okay, so does anyone want to explain the principle there, which is in fact evidence for the truth of materialism?
The goal of justification. So the fact that I'm reading or listening now, you can use the principle of justification to say truth or not, real or not.
I'm not quite sure I understand exactly the idea that you're setting forth.
My understanding is you ask the principle of something. So the principle of something to prove that I'm right or not is the principle of justification by faith, and how to verify what's the evidence. So that's what I meant.
Okay. I think I understand what you're saying now. So that's not actually, I mean, that's of course true principles, but that's not the principle contained in this explanation, which is evidence for materialism. So does anyone have something else in mind that is the principle which is evidence for materialism?
I mean, I think this is a little bit backdoor evidence for materialism, but basically, if it's happening, if we can measure something or experience something is actually happening in the material world, then it's true. And because it's because we're having to measure something in the material world, then materialism has to be true. If we can measure something or experience something, I think the principle is that you can prove something because it's measurable or experienceable in the material world. And in order for that to be true, then materialism has to be true.
Okay, so that was really interesting listening to your comment. I'll tell you what I mean by that. So there was one moment early on in you making your comment where I was like, yeah, I think you're really explaining it. And then I thought, maybe not, maybe you're not quite getting it. But then at the end, it sounds like you're getting it again. So you may actually be really, really getting that principle. How about this? I'll explain it in a different way. And maybe it is what you were thinking, maybe it isn't exactly what you were thinking. But either way, I think that you may be getting. I'll explain the principle, and Heavenly Family, help me to do it in the clearest way possible. So here's the thing: what this is pointing out, much in the same way that we had to talk about the idea conveyed by the word immaterial. Now we're talking about the idea conveyed by the word truth. Because remember, none of these words actually have inherent meaning. They don't intrinsically convey a certain thought or hold some sort of meaning in them, as though meaning is some sort of independent thing. Meaning is our own attribution to a particular thing. So the idea that is conveyed by the word truth is actually that which corresponds to material reality. That is actually the idea of the word truth. Now, I'll qualify this a little bit, because obviously sometimes people say it's true that God exists and God is non-physical. Well, now they're using the word truth to mean not simply that which corresponds to material reality, but it's also including their particular belief. But then when you really question what they mean by that, you come to an inconsistent definition of the term truth. In other words, anytime someone puts forth a belief that is asserting the non-physical, they are having a conflict not only in their definition of what immaterial is, but they also come to a conflict in their definition of what truth is. But in every single instance of someone using the word truth in a consistent way and in a way that literally everyone will agree with, in every instance that meets those qualifications. Again, the qualifications are consistency and universal agreement. Every time you use the word truth in a consistent and universally agreed upon way, what it means is that which corresponds to material reality, sometimes even as distinct from anything else. So for me to say, we are on the call right now, and this is why I've said that I've explained these things before, for me to say, we are all on the conference call right now, you would all agree that that statement is true. But here's the thing, what it means for that statement to be true is that it corresponds to material reality. That's the principle. The principle is that what it means for something to be true is for it to correspond to material reality. That's actually what it means, and again, under any consistent definition of the term truth. And also, additionally, under every usage of the term truth upon which everyone will agree that it is a correct usage. Because of that, because the very idea which the word truth conveys is the idea of correspondence to material reality, by definition, materialism is true. There's no other way to consistently define terms. Materialism has to be true. It cannot be not true. Because, again, that is actually what truth means. That is the very idea of truth. So yeah, I'm not sure exactly if that's the nuance that you're getting to, Ed, but you said in your comment that everything that is measurable and, shown to be, everything that's provable, measurable, factual, etc., is true. Everything that is material is true. And it seemed like maybe you're kind of pointing out that that's actually what truth is. What truth means is to be material, and so that would require materialism being true. So anyway, that's another evidence in favor of materialism, and I think it's just as strong, at least, as the fact that immaterialism is by definition false. So one is automatically or has no chance of being true, immaterialism, whereas materialism has no way of not being true. So does that make sense to everyone?
It does.
Yes.
So I have a question.
Sure.
Like, I think we were all kind of hurting our brains trying to prove that materialism is true through some kind of thought process of, like, experimentation or whatever. Like, instead of proving that the opposite of materialism is false, which I understand exactly where you're coming from, and I agree with that. And I think that in the back of our mind, we all have probably thought that way. We've had to, as we've existed in the material world. We just never put it into words and maybe even never put it into thought. But I'm just wondering, is there a way to just purely prove materialism, the evidence for materialism? The only way I can say it is not through the back door.
So here's the thing. What I would say is that what we just went through is actually experimental, while it is definitely only indirect experiment. Because what we are doing, the way in which it is experimental is simply in that it is putting to test the consistency of certain claims and ideas. And of course, that includes seeing whether an idea is actually internally consistent or whether it contradicts itself, because an idea which contradicts itself is not feasible and is not true. And so, I'll put it like this. Doing a direct experiment, let's say in a lab, is actually just carrying out the principles that we have spoken of before as being the fundamental principles of logic. That's really what it's doing. It's taking critical thinking and applying it in a specific circumstance. Well, since you can do no specific circumstantial experiment to test reality as a whole, you have to go with an indirect experiment to really establish that. And so what we had to do here was do an indirect experiment on the concept, on the idea of immateriality, as well as on the idea of truth, which we found to actually be materiality. So it is an indirect experiment, and that is the only way to conclusively prove that materialism is true. I would say that it is the strongest evidence. However, I will say that while it is not proof, there are experiments more of the nature that I believe you're likely talking about that do actually strongly indicate materialism, but I don't think they are as strong evidence as the indirect experiments that we just conducted, nor do they constitute actual proof. But what they show is how very unlikely immateriality is, and really establishes evidence for material reality actually being material reality. And you'll understand more what I mean when I explain some of these experiments. So it's actually really cool. And for all of what I'm about to say, I'm going to be commenting upon subjects which I do not have a complete understanding of. I have a very incomplete understanding of these subjects, but I have done indirect experiments, which certainly establishes the credibility of those who know far more on these subjects than I do. because we're talking about physics, and so physics is quite complicated and requires a lot of proficiency in mathematics and the ability to conduct very, very precise experiments. So it's pretty crazy stuff. But I'll mention some things, and I'll also send you guys some links. I'll post them in the Branch Davidian SDA Facebook group that goes through some of this stuff in more detail than I am capable of. And I think that you guys will all enjoy it. So basically, first I'll actually mention, in case this crosses anyone's mind now or someone listening to this later, sometimes people assert that quantum physics or quantum mechanics has disproved materialism. What I've learned in listening to physicists and learning about the experiments and the methods involved is that nothing could be further from the truth, because things which were not known to actually be physical things prior to the advent of quantum mechanics in the 1920s have now been demonstrated to, in fact, be material. Now, physics is bizarre stuff. Like, it is like, whoa, this is totally nuts, but it's so very materialistic in nature. Like, it is so rigidly materialistic. So here's the thing. I'll give an example. Light. Prior to the 1920s, light was viewed as being a wave in electromagnetic fields. Now, that wasn't strictly like an immaterialistic view, but a wave is a motion and not actually made of matter on its own. Quantum mechanics showed that actually light can be broken up into discrete units, the smallest unit of which is actually a particle called a photon. That's actually a particle, and that's like, wow, okay, so light is actually physical stuff. It is also found that other things which people might think of as immaterial, and people might say, oh, well, this is if you view it as a independently existing thing, then you would say it's an immaterial thing, and some people do that. But quantum mechanics has shown that actually that's not the case. For example, gravity. It's a force, but actually it can be broken into discrete units that are particles called gravitons. There are two other forces called the strong force and the weak force. And when you break them up into their most discrete or minimal units, they are actually particles which have been labeled as gluons. Everything, when you break it up, becomes labeled as a gluon. Now, here's something that I would say. There are experiments that have been done numerous times which, even though, to my knowledge, were not done with the intention of testing immateriality. These experiments would be the best experiments to do if you wanted to test immateriality. And that is to try to create nothing. Because again, immateriality by definition is nothing. So if you could actually make nothing, you would actually be proving immateriality. So people, scientists, have actually done this many times, to do everything they can to make nothing, to actually subtract all the matter out of something. And basically it's creating vacuums. So again, in a very real way, you could say that that's testing, whether advertently or inadvertently, that's testing immateriality? Can you actually make nothing? The amazing thing is that you cannot. Nothing cannot be made. I know that could mean a few things, but hopefully you all understand what I'm saying in this context. It is impossible to make nothing. You can take out all the particles, all the atoms, and what are you left with? It's an amazing discovery of science that empty space itself is actually amaterial. And one of the videos that I'll send you guys, it's actually two videos. It's a lecture and a discussion by a Nobel Prize winning physicist, and the discussion is between him and a colleague. And it's called The Materiality of a Vacuum. And they explain what has been found by means of actual, very, very rigorous experiments, that so-called empty space is not actually empty. It actually weighs something. It even has polarity. It has actual physical properties. Space itself can actually be bent. It can melt. It has all of these properties. It's really material. There is no such thing as nothing. There's no such thing as empty space. Even when you take out all the atoms, and by the way, there are other particles. Atoms are made of three types of particles: protons, neutrons, and electrons. But there are many other particles aside from those that make up atoms. And the greatest engineering feat of humanity ever is known as the Large Hadron Collider. And it is this giant 26-kilometer tunnel that is buried under the ground, and in this tunnel is a vacuum, and they shoot particles like protons and whatever else. They accelerate these particles to very, 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 very near the speed of light and crash them into each other, and have incredible detectors to be able to trace every particle that comes off from that. And, it's really incredible what they can do with this machine. And anyway, they've done many experiments and have discovered many particles by use of this Large Hadron Collider. And there are other amazing pieces of equipment that have been invented and used to actually detect particles that are very, very evasive at times. But anyway, in 2012, a particle that had beforehand been predicted to exist, and the actual properties of it and everything had been predicted to exist. In 2012, the Large Hadron Collider was actually used to experimentally find, to actually detect these particles called Higgs particles or Higgs boson particles. And these are the particles of even empty space. When you take away everything, you still have something. That's another way to say that you can't actually take away everything. It's actually impossible to remove everything. You have stuff, no matter what. Even when you do everything that you can to make no stuff, you always have stuff. That to me is absolutely incredible, and it teaches us so many other things. There's so many things to learn about reality through this. And one of the things that's quite interesting is that literally the whole universe and every bit of matter within the universe is in a superconductor. A superconductor is a type of material. There are many different types of superconductors, and the Higgs particles that are literally everywhere actually constitute as a whole a giant superconductor, which means that the matter which goes through it, the various particles, which travel through this actually are going through a superconductor, which changes its properties. And so, really interesting. Like, physics is absolutely amazing. There are so many discoveries taking place in physics, and where, most people walking down the street, all of us probably included, our view of physics is probably not much different from that of Isaac Newton's. But there's been so much more. Like, even in the past 20 years, physicists have discovered a lot. And it is amazing how there are some experiments that have been conducted which are probably as close as you can come to testing immateriality. And basically, the answer to every experiment in physics so far is materialism. That's what you get. So that's pretty cool. So hopefully, I don't know, Ed, you can tell me one way or the other if that gives you kind of the sort of thing that you're looking for.
Yeah, I think so. I think I just need to be comfortable with the fact that, and I'm becoming more and more comfortable with it. You have to understand, I've always been a materialist, so I've never believed in the immaterial anyway, and I know other people, I'm not going to say their names, agree with that or have also been the exact same way. So, we've lived our whole life this way, and then like to be faced with trying to explain why we believe that or the evidence we have for that, something we hadn't thought of. But, yeah, so I'm becoming comfortable with the whole idea that you can prove it through the fact that immateriality is not true and can't be true, therefore the opposite of it has to be true, because we do have experiences and we do have science, so there has to be some kind of reality because of the fact that we can even do a scientific experiment.
Exactly. That's like some physicists will talk about this actually, like, why is there something rather than nothing? Then the answer is basically, well, if there was nothing, you couldn't write the book on why is there nothing rather than something. You wouldn't be there to do it. So it's just kind of like there is something. And actually what materialism shows, and I've never heard a physicist say this or anything, but materialism, what it actually shows is that there cannot be nothing. Like, it actually could not be any other way. Like, there has to be something that is just the nature of existence, reality, whatever. And honestly, I think that the whole question of, well, why couldn't there be non-existence is perhaps the best way for me to put that is that type of thought is the closest thing to a mental fart that anyone will ever have. Because literally, it's just a nonsensical idea. It's really just like, oh, why isn't there nothing? The very statement is a self-contradiction. Why couldn't there be nothing? The word be is another form of the word exist. To be, to exist. It means the same thing.
Trent?
To say, why? Yes?
Sorry, I was just going to say that reminds me of time. Why can't there be no time? Does that make sense? It's a kind of the same thing. Like, you can't imagine no time.
Right. Now, but the fact that you can't imagine it isn't the reason why it has to be. But it's a good point to say, like, the reason why you can't imagine it is because it is an impossibility. Like, in this particular instance, the reason why it cannot be imagined is because it is a self-refuting concept. And in fact, this is another thing that science has shown. Physicists usually do not talk about space and time. They talk about space-time. The reason why is because time is actually just a characteristic of space. It's not something that's separable from space. If there was no time, there would be no space. If there was no space, there would be no time. Space-time is one thing. because, again, time is really just the system of sequential relations between events, and events are always physical. Events are physical interactions. That's what they are. So that's the thing, like, the whole idea that there could be nothing is actually a stupid idea. Like, it actually just doesn't even make sense. It is an incoherent idea that there could be nothing, because even the word be just, it means to exist. There could not be non-existence. Why is there existence rather than non-existence? Is means to exist. There is existence. Existence is. Those are the equivalent statements. Non-existence is not. Period. I mean,
so true.
Kind of,
yeah.
Yeah. It's the same thing as to why the future does not exist. The future only will exist. It does not exist, because that's actually just a silly idea. Like, for the future to exist now, because again, the word does is present tense, not future tense, to say that the future does exist is just a contradiction of terms. In the same way, to talk about nothing existing or non-existence existing, those types of expressions are contradictions of terms. It's absolutely nonsensical. So the reason why there is something other than nothing is because there is. Maybe that sounds redundant, and maybe it sounds like a non-answer, but that actually is a real answer. And I'd say it's a good one. Like, it is really, there couldn't be a better answer to anything, in truth. So anyway, I hope that everyone understands materialism a bit better and understands how we can know that materialism is true. And I hope that you all understand that it is. And I hope, even if at this one moment, if you find yourself incapable of being able to really explain the evidence for materialism, of being able to explain how we can know that it is true, I can understand that, because these are, if you're not used to having to explain something, sometimes it can be hard. But I want to encourage you all to actually explain how you can know materialism is true. You know, to actually practice explaining that to each other, and you could ask each other, like, hey, does this make sense the way I'm explaining this? And I hope that the way that I explained it is clear enough that people can understand it. I don't say that this way of explaining it is the only way or the best way. There may very well be clearer ways. And it is upon us all to develop the clearest ways to express truth that we can, because by that means we can help others to understand the truth. If we can't explain it, we can't help them to understand it. So we need to really make it a serious point in our lives. We need to make a serious effort to try to explain the truth in as clear a way as possible, whether it's the truth of materialism itself, what we could say is the ultimate truth, or whether it is the truth of Jesus' existence, his death, his resurrection, the truth of the nature of morality or the solution to immorality. Whatever it may be, it is our duty to do everything we can to learn to explain these truths in as clear a manner as possible, which is another way of me advocating Ellen White's counsel to cultivate the gift of speech. So anyway, are there any final questions or comments? We've been on the call now for a little over an hour, so we should bring it to an end soon. But does anyone have any comments or questions?
It seems like immaterial things is what led people astray, like Jones and Wagner and the other man, I forget his name.
Leroy said that it seems like immateriality is basically what leads people astray. It's what the devil has used to lead people astray. And yes, I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I'll read a statement from the Silver Trumpet, Volume 1, Number 9, page 5, at the end of paragraph 2, to that effect. Materialism is the foundation of truth. To destroy it is to destroy all. The assertion that the immaterial is real is the assertion that the non-existent exists in the very idea of it. It is, at its core, the declaration of that which is not true as being true, and is therefore the idea of a lie itself. Now, there's more in this context that elucidates that point, but yes, immateriality is what leads astray. And actually, going with immateriality is what it means to go astray. Just like going with material reality is what it means to follow the truth. Because truth, the idea of that word, is actually that which corresponds to material reality. So, yeah, I appreciate your comment, Leroy. Does anyone else have any comments or questions? And if not, would somebody like to thank our Heavenly Family?
Could you read that next paragraph, Trent? It's powerful.
I sure will read the next paragraph. It is the lie which was introduced by the arch-deceiver. It was the lie that led the antediluvian world astray. It was the lie that established Babylon, that controlled Pharaoh, that held up the religions of the Canaanites, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, the Greeks. It was the lie which took the form of Plato's transcendentalism, and which came into Judaism via Hellenization and corrupted the true faith of the Messiah and took the form of Christianity. The lie is responsible for the Dark Ages and for every other wicked catastrophe which has reared its ugly head to demolish all that is good, whole, and pure. The lie is what led astray Jones, Wagner, and Kellogg. The lie is what has polluted the sanctuary, destroyed the priesthood, and so long delayed the building of the spiritual house. I'll continue even a little further. Branches, you have recently been called to enter into priesthood and to build the temple of Yahweh. If you have not been filled with love and zeal for the truth, and exchanged your thoughts for the thoughts of our Heavenly Family, know that the lie has a hold on you. How will truth re-enter? How will reason and love take the day? Exercise your will. Stretch your minds to comprehend the truth. Receive correction. Let your mind be molded according to the divine similitude. And I'll end there. I encourage you all, though, to read the Silver Trumpet, Volume 1, Number 9, again, the whole thing, And also Materialism, Our Forgotten Foundation, which is a compilation of statements by the SDA pioneers regarding materialism. And most of it is evidencing that the ancient Jewish scriptures advocate materialism, but there are also some articles contained therein which address materialism on more philosophical grounds. So all that said, would anyone like to thank our Heavenly Family?
I will. Heavenly Family, we thank you for guiding us into all truth. I pray that you would be with each of us and help us to understand this and help us to be able to reiterate it and explain it to others. And I thank you for pointing it out that it is our duty to do this, because if we don't do this, then we really don't love others. And so I pray that you would open our minds and help us understand. And thank you again. In the name of the branching sheet, amen.
Amen. All right, love you all a lot. Have a good night.
Night.